Thank you. So we start the day with a discussion about British travel maps, mostly from the 18th century, the cartographic representation of roads and the effect these maps had on the traveller's perception and experience of travel. As such, this is principally going to be a talk about the traveller and the consumption of maps rather than map making and the knowledge in making of the surveyor or cartographer. My main point in this is that 18th century travel maps marginalised topography, the physical appearance of nature, literally reducing it to the map's margins. These are maps of travel itself, not representations of an area of land, a landscape. As representations of travel, the maps we'll look at are, in their way, mapping the modern within early modern Britain. In British history, modernity has, among many other attributes, been characterised as the new and distinct presence of speed, not just the broad history of increasingly rapid societal change, but the acceleration of the daily experience of life. Travel, physical movement through geographic space, was a key area in which this increase in speed was experienced. As illustrated here in this fold-out map from Patterson's 1785 British itinerary, by the late 18th century, the nationwide proliferation of new or improved turnpike roads had created a national network. However, the modernity of the early modern road network in Britain does not rest in its existence or its extents. Many roads followed very ancient routes, but in the speed of movement within it. These new direct roads, as Patterson calls them, were metalled, that is, dressed to a firmness and fineness of surface that allowed horses and coaches to move fast safely. Consequently, journey times from A to B became exponentially shorter through the 18th century. Faster journey times enabled both more journeys and longer journeys, making the world much busier and to seem at once both larger and smaller. It was, as the 17th poet John Taylor wrote, a rattling, rolling and rumbling age. Travel maps and itineraries were produced in order that the modern traveller, more specifically the wealthy map-buying traveller, could physically and conceptually navigate this fast-moving world. These are not conventional maps. Travel maps provide information on places to leave from, places to go to, and the roads in between, not geographic areas. They depict the lines of roads punctuated by the nodes of cities, towns, villages and stage stops, inns to change horses, rest, eat, sleep. Topographic features such as rivers, hills, moors, fields and forests are featured only as encountered en route, not least because they might be obstacles or could be navigation aids. This is maps 3 and 4 from Patterson's itinerary showing the Great North Road through Bedfordshire towards Cambridgeshire, passing through Biggleswade, Buckden and Huntingdon. It also shows the principal inns along that section of the Great North Road, including the famous Wheatsheaf at Alconbury Hill, demolished in the 30s. What is striking about this map, as you'll have noticed, is the strip format. The narrow strip breaks the convention whereby maps illustrate areas, countries, counties, towns within a square or rectangular frame. Such maps are broad representations of place, of settlement, of landscape. In contrast, the strip map is a linear representation of routes, long and narrow. As in similar publications, Patterson's strips are arranged into columns or narrow vertical cells, 2 or 3 per page, to fit a standard pocketbook format. Within each cell, the road dominates, mapping a line of travel moving from bottom to top up the page. Topographical information is reduced to only what is found within the margins. It is a narrow view of nature, the restricted horizon bounded by the cell. From one strip to the next, the visual information provided, such as hills, trees, and prominent buildings, varies. The topography illustrated by Patterson is particularly minimal. Overall, within the reduced world of the cell, some strip maps include more features than others. Broadly, but not consistently, Later maps contain less topographic information. In the section of the Great North Road from Grantham to Newcastle in Smith's 1826 pocket companion to the roads of England and Wales, steep gradients are marked as are the boundaries of country estates, but besides the road itself, the space within the cells is dominated by waypoints. In contrast, if we look at the road from London to Flamborough Head in Yorkshire here, from Ogilby's 1675 folio atlas Britannia, one of the earliest collection of early modern strip maps, the format itself harks back to 13th century pilgrimage itineraries, famously by Matthew Paris, we find that a range of features are depicted in relief rather than plan, such as hills topped with little windmills. Ogilby's map shows the extent of the national roadwork in the mid-17th century. This is not the same world as the fast-moving turnpike network shown in later 18th century maps. In 1675, London to Chester took 4 days. By 1790, this had dropped to 1. So, through the 18th century, we find faster roads, faster journeys, and maps that show less and less as travel is abstracted from nature. That's a problem there. Although unintentionally perhaps, the strip format in Taylor and Skinner's map of the road from Tarbert Inn to Crean Larrock, from a survey and maps of North Britain or Scotland, the strip actually serves to emphasise the long, narrow highland topography of Loch Lomond and Loch Erne. Looking at a wider British Atlantic world, trees, rivers and hills encountered en route feature frequently in Cole's 1789 Survey of the Roads of the United States, as here in a stretch of the King's Highway from New York to Trenton via Princeton. For the most part, excluding Ogilby's atlas, strip maps were published as practical, pocket-sized books, intended to live mobile lives on the road. They were not folio editions destined for the library table and quiet contemplation. Looking at a strip map projected on a wall, we gain some sense of the movement within these images. The map resting on a traveller's lap, a finger tracing the route, moving along the line of the road, out past the needs towards the open road ahead. Strip maps serve the needs of the traveller. For the traveller focused on getting there, movement through the landscape was presented as it was experienced, a narrow linear world, A, B, the road, its margins. In a fast, reliable, itinerarized world, the traveller had no need to know what landscape features lay beyond. However, some travellers did want to know where they were for reasons of pleasure or delight. The late Georgian phenomenon of the polite tourist was deeply connected to the picturesque and the visual appreciation of landscape. Like any other traveller, the polite tourist used travel maps to navigate their way through the British Isles. However, as we've seen, the format of strip maps had evolved to the exclusion of wider topography. Moreover, topographic features, hills, moors, glens, were now for the tourist not in between places, but the destinations in themselves. Although travel accounts such as The Wanderer from 1804 reveal the very modern tourist practice of travelling blindly as quickly as possible to an approved site in which to move slowly, was well established by the late Georgian period. One solution to this cartographic conundrum was found in publications such as Baker's Imperial Guide, 1802. In format and page layout, this travel book is much like a standard collection of strip maps. However, the information provided has changed, as has its visual presentation. The finger still traces the line of the road, moving upward and onward from bottom to top of the page, but the line now moves through a sequence of landscapes and townscapes, so-called miniature likenesses of pleasant hills, church spires and country house elevations, informing the traveller not only of where they are or will be, but also what they will enjoy looking at there. Here, the physical distance of geographic spaces are abstracted as landscape is brought to the fore, and big vistas, not just the immediate view from the carriage window, are shrunk to fit within the cell. This abstraction and squeezing together of sites is taken to an extreme in this circular map from the Imperial Guide, depicting the scenic day trips that can be made when staying in Tunbridge Wells, shown at the centre of the circle. Indeed, if we look at Carey's 1799 survey of high roads from London, we find just such a confluence in a book that is both practical travel aid and tourist guide. This is the map of the road from Colnbrook in Berkshire to Maidenhead in Kent, showing the route through Windsor Great Park. All practical stuff. It even shows turnpike gates. But you can also see that the map is marked with sight lines from various points along the road towards picturesque sites such as Eton College and Windsor Castle. Now, as a sort of part two to this paper, I'm going to turn to the matter of inns. As here, the top left corner of Carey's map, you may have noticed that inns are named and or marked on all the travel maps seen so far. On Cole's survey of the roads of the United States, for instance, inns are marked by a small gallows-like symbol representing a roadside inn, as was common outside inns in early modern Britain and North America. As shown in this illustration of the Eagle Tavern in Pennsylvania. Inns were central to the early modern travel network. They were the urban termini for stage services, such as the Angel Islington or the Elephant and Castle. Indeed, many inns operated their own service in partnership with other inns on a route. They were also important stage stops. Whether in town or country, a coach or horse and rider had to stop every 7 to 20 miles, extending through the 18th century, known as a stage, to refresh or change horses, grease coach axles, feed and rest the weary traveller. The typical Georgian coaching inn, like the George on the Great North Road in Stamford, Lincolnshire here, was therefore not an alehouse or a tavern, but a complex and highly sophisticated travel operation, focused exclusively on a polite clientele that involved multiple skilled staff, coachman, farrier, stableboy, cook, waiter, chambermaid, and specialised spaces, coachyard, stables, kitchens, dining room, parlour, bedrooms, all working to time marked by the coaching clock. In fact, I saw a very nice 17th century coach clock at the Angel in Guildford yesterday. What has this to do with topography? Well, beyond explaining their presence on travel maps, I've introduced the inn because inns, or rather innkeepers, were producers of their own travel information, including maps and itineraries. Innkeepers were keenly aware of their role in the transport revolution and of their need to stay ahead of the competition. Accordingly, they advertised a lot. For example, this advert from the York Herald, 1826, topped with an engraving of a fast-moving coach and horses, proclaims, "Cheap and expeditious travelling from the George Hotel, Stamford, to Norwich, the Union, leaves the above hotel every morning at 7:30 after the arrival of the York Flyer." Innkeepers also circulated travel cards. These often feature complex pictorial devices targeting the needs and expectations of the traveller. For instance, this 1792 card for the Bell in Gloucester lists the distances and stops to Milford Haven. To Milford Haven, London, and Holyhead in the manner of a published travel itinerary. The surrounding imagery is interesting. The list is topped by scrollwork supporting a resting nymph or goddess and a putti, suggesting neoclassical norms of polite good taste may be expected, and a bunch of grapes, the promise of wine, port, and Madeira. The titular bell is suspended beneath the name of the innkeeper, Peyton. Located prominently within the scroll, the success of an inn often rested on the personal reputation of the innkeeper for keeping what Robert Burns calls good cheer. Around the top of the scroll it reads, London, Bristol and Bath coach office, while at the bottom is a scene of a coach and horses galloping past a milestone, which reads 105 miles to London. For eye-catching novelty, the trade card for the Black Swan, or Clark's Hotel in York, reaches its own peak of abstraction in the presentation of travel distances within and around the body of a swan. Within this collage of information and imagery, many trade cards also featured travel maps showing the route served by the inn. In this example for the Crown at Stone in Staffordshire, proudly displaying a new elegant building by the architect Henry Holland, a route map is framed within a lozenge at the bottom of the card, placing the inn at the centre of a road network extending outward to London, Chester and Liverpool. What is interesting in cartographic terms about inn-produced maps like this is that topography is abandoned to an even greater extent than in any published strip map or travel guide. Indeed, it's abandoned altogether. As in this trade card for the Lion in Shrewsbury, there is in fact no topography at all. Only the route set against a void, a pure in-between space of travel. The route, London to Holyhead, becomes a line on a red field, punctuated only by dots for destinations. This is a distilled representation of travel. So, survey maps of the early modern period, notably, of course, the Ordnance Survey, established the way we read place in the lines marking roads, rivers, and inclines, and in little symbols for houses, churches, and trees. Strip maps are within this tradition, but what is distinct and distinctly modern about the strip map is the strip itself, narrowing the world down to the line of travel. The route maps produced by inns in the early modern period take this further, as the line of travel becomes the only information represented. As fast direct roads became the norm, there was no need for the topographic conventions of the survey map. These are very modern maps because they represent a world in which a traveller could move speedily around a reliable transport network, travel without the need to know one's whereabouts. Nature is first reduced, then eliminated from the cartographic imagination to present a fast, mobile modern world outside of nature. Thank you.